last meeting or the last two meetings that we had here at Phelps Park? Raise your hand. And if it's your first time, please raise your hand. Sweet. Thanks for joining us. So we're going to ground ourselves in a few principles that we do this community organizing work, that we root our work in. All Black Lives Matter. That means straight, queer, cisgender, transgender, born here, born somewhere else. Black people matter. Loud Black people matter. Black people that make you uncomfortable matter. Listen to Black folks. That's what we've been doing. We've been listening to Black folks. That's it. It's not rocket science. It's not revolutionary. I mean, it is revolutionary in a white supremacist society. Break bread with your neighbor. Some people call it community. We call it community building. And we're not going to unpack all these principles today, but it's just something to base us, ground us in, and we'll talk about them over time. And another one is accountability. So how do we hold one another accountable? How do we acknowledge we all have blinders? I'm a man, so I don't understand what it means to be a woman. I didn't grow up queer. I don't understand those struggles. It's a lifelong process, right? So we need to be surrounded by people who are going to hold us. And this is not an exhaustive list of principles. We will build on those. We will grow. We will unpack those over time. With that said, there's also a lot of terms that we'll be talking about. Are there any terms that people want clarification on today? There's a Google Drive that we'll be sharing with folks. But gentrification is one that's going to come up a lot. We talked about it the last couple of weeks. Gentrification, it's the changing of neighborhoods due to policy and real estate investment, the displacement of poor people.
Okay. And I want to talk a little bit more about how it came to be, because I think what people see now is they see the celebration and they see the party and they see the vendors and it's, oh, happy day. And Juneteenth is a combination of June and 19th. And so June 19th, 1863, Galveston, Texas, the Emancipation Proclamation was 2.5 years old, and people in Texas, because Texas defied that proclamation and actively encouraged and supported slavery to the point that Confederate states to the east, as Union troops liberated those slaves, they moved west to Texas that welcomed them with open arms. And so it wasn't until 1863 and then 1865, when the Civil War finally ended, that you actually had Union troops that came and enforced that proclamation. And so people were happy. My father is from East Texas, and he tells the other side of the story, that people were happy. That's true. But he grew up in the 30s and 40s, and so there were still people alive who were there that day. And so while it was a beautiful and wonderful thing, it was also just another step in the fight, because you had slave owners who were so enraged that they killed the Black people that they had enslaved rather than let them be free. And so I tell that part of the story because I think the happy part is the great part. But we have to always remember that whenever there has been a movement forward for Black people, there has been an instantaneous and harsh backlash from the majority culture. And that backlash is coming. And so even though we are here today and there was a beautiful thing here yesterday in the park, I think that we have to remember that that builds on a lot of work and a lot of sacrifice and a lot of dead Black bodies. And George Floyd is just the most recent that we have here. And so Juneteenth is a wonderful thing, but I think I also want people to remember that, okay, it marks another spot in the fight. And so we have to continue. Okay, so celebrate, but recognize what it is. White supremacy doesn't celebrate Black liberation, and it didn't then, and it doesn't now. Okay.
All right, so we're going to do a little recap. So last week, if you were here, we kind of brought the struggle up to today, gentrification, what's been happening in the last decade or so. And today I want to start by talking about 38th in Chicago. There's a push right now to reopen this intersection by our council member, Andrea Jenkins. And again, as we talk about this work, we're depersonalizing it. Anything we say about politicians is not personal. They have the face of power, and they lie. Let's be 100. So Jenkins just sent out an update to the whole 8th Ward saying she wants to reopen this intersection safely. And she painted a scary picture of gunshots and drug dealing and drug using and minors drinking. You know, I don't want to say that that is the safe sort of community we're trying to build, but guess what? I experience all that growing up on a daily, right? That's not the problem. The problem is, why do people have to sell drugs? Why do people feel unsafe? Why they got to carry pistols in this community? Racial capitalism is the problem. This is an old battle for land. It goes back 400 years in this country. And it's playing out on 38th Street in Chicago in 2020. So when communities get gentrified with people who know nothing about the community, and I'm gonna say some things that not everybody's gonna agree with, but again, I don't mince words. And the goal is not to push anybody away or to shame folks. We want to pull people in, but we got to speak some hard truths. So when the Karens and the Becky start to move in the community changes for them. Derek Chauvin was protecting gentrifiers. He thought he was doing his job. And if you understand the history of policing, he was. So we have to understand what's been happening in these last 20 years or so. This community has radically changed. And the people who helped pioneer this community, their voices have been completely silenced. And these are the same people that work in our grocery stores, in our restaurants. They serve our fast food. A lot of y'all don't even think they deserve a living wage. A lot of these business owners starve their employees. They put them in the back of the house, right? And then we all live together in a community. People are shocked that this happened on the South Side, but not if you were paying attention. Everybody was like, yo, we thought that would have popped off on Broadway on the North Side, but guess what? Here's a fundamental difference between North and South Side. On the South Side, you have extreme wealth, extreme white wealth, and extreme black and brown poverty coexisting. North Side is being gentrified, but it ain't nowhere near where we're at here on the South Side. So when you create those dynamics and you create those conditions, and then you deny it, and you blame those people for their own conditions, and then you murder them, and then you deny them justice, and you keep voting for the politicians that arranged his murder. The city council and the mayor arranged the murder of George Floyd by funding the police unprecedented amounts, by not checking, by not providing real systems of accountability. The council had the power to take over the police from the mayor, and they did not. They failed to do that. See where your council member voted on that, right? These people who ran for office 2017, they ran as champions on equity. Check their record. Just because they're black or brown doesn't mean they're not siding with power. Let's see if they're landlords, right? When they're making these decisions, are they making the decision as a black person or as a landlord? Are they making their votes based on their experience as a business owner or as a laborer, as a renter or a homeowner? We need to have these hard questions. So today, again, you're going to hear a lot. We're not going to be able to process and unpack it all. We're going to break up into small groups after our speakers, and then we're asking folks to take these conversations back to your blocks. My block met yesterday, and you know, it was a really good discussion, and it's the same discussion we've been having for years, but now folks really want to step up and do some stuff, right? So let's keep that going. So Sandra Richardson was born and raised in this community, right here in Oakland. So 2 weeks ago, she gave a much more in-depth history. Today, she's going to give a brief recap, and we're kind of working our way backwards before we introduce our guest speaker, Daniel Bergin. Raise your hand if you've seen the Jim Crow of the North movie. Raise your hand if you knew before watching it that it was about not just the city of Minneapolis, but this very community too. Right? All right, let's give it up one more time for Sandra Richardson.
I'm going to be very brief with the recap because I really want to give time for Daniel to share the information that he has for us. As Marjaan said, I hate technology sometimes. Can you hear me now? No? Yes? Yes? Okay. Awkward, but I'll try. So yeah, I was raised right over on 41st and Oakland. My mother still lives there. And I have spent most of my life in this part of South Minneapolis, so I know this little bit of geography like no other. Um, and the story of African Americans in this part of South Minneapolis is the story of a striving community. It is the story of a close knit community. And it's also the story of how you destabilize a striving, well-knit African American community. And I talked a couple of weeks ago about the closing of public spaces, like all three of the public schools that serve this community, one by one were closed. And so it wasn't just that you couldn't walk to school through your neighborhood anymore. It also, those schools were also public places. So you had community meetings, you had group meetings that were held. And that was siphoned away from us. And Daniel's going to talk about redlining and the segregation in South Minneapolis. And so I'm not going to take too much more time before letting him do that. But I think that one of the things that I've come to the realization of is that systemic kind of disenfranchisement of people in this part of South Minneapolis really needs to be documented in a step-by-step way, because what happens here is not unusual. It's just part of the playbook. And I think that people tend to think that, oh, that just happened here because certain forces came together. And that's not it. It's, if you look at what happened to this community, it happened all over the country. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Daniel. I'm so happy to see you again. I wish we could hug, but you know.
Good to see you all. This is powerful, this idea of legacy. One of the ways I connected with Sandra was in researching her father and some of his activism and leadership here on the South Side and in Minneapolis. So this just powerful idea of, people descended from enslaved people, carrying that historic trauma, but really being revolutionary in how they're building up community in spite of all that. So I'm Daniel Bergin. I'm a producer by day with Twin Cities PBS. Also, can you hear me? Okay, how's that? Also, got to really eat the mic. I'm Daniel Bergin, producer and director with Twin Cities PBS. I'm also an independent filmmaker and interested in the stories in our communities that might not always make it to, the mainstream broadcast projects that I do. So I've been working on stories about South Central Minneapolis and its unique Black history beyond what you learned about in Jim Crow of the North. So it's cool to be in this space. I love the parks. I grew up right across the street from Powderhorn Park. These are our spaces. This particular space, Chicago Field, it was originally called, was envisioned as a place of fellowship. There was actually early on an idea for a two-story rec center 100 years ago. Didn't happen then, but this idea of these places of being gathering spaces and being used in this way was really part of the original vision. So this feels right. And I also just love this aesthetic, the hoops going on behind me. And as someone involved in media, part of the problem, part of the progress is about narratives and changing the narrative. And I was thinking this morning as I got here and was watching the football practice, how often do we see this story of these brothers here with these young people, kind of working it, volunteering. It happens all the time. It happens here. It happens in all these parks. And how often do you see that story, the story that's happening right behind me, that image right there? I mean, this is part of the challenge and part of why I think, with my work in public media, really representing these alternative narratives is important. And that was part of the idea behind Jim Crow of the North, is just to continue to reframe the local history and provide us an understanding and some of the roots of the disparities that, as we know, are worse in the nation. So it was great to see how many of you have already seen and learned through Jim Crow of the North. That is just, again, a few of the stories and really very few of the lived experiences in terms of the oppression that these restrictive covenants and the red lines that followed were the way folks had to live through that trauma. One of my regrets in that film was not being able to include more stories. And so that's kind of Sandra's point about continuing to to capture and to share and to learn from the stories of folks who lived through that, and we're living through some of that now. As a storyteller, and I think this can inform even how you all work together, I'm interested in something called restorative narratives. And this isn't something that like my bosses are into or know of, I don't know, but this idea of healthy stories that are sustained inquiry, so you stay with the story, about universal truths, so that it's compelling and appealing and relates to many people. It's also about hard truth, and that's what we endured in watching A Jim Crow of the North. But that it's also strength-based, and so that we're learning. In my case, as a history documentary producer, we're learning about some of the assets of our community, and that idea of asset-based storytelling is really essential to my work. So that's why I'm drawn to stories like the ones of the Richardsons. And as some of you heard 2 weeks ago from Sandra, this idea of Nicollet Fields becoming Martin Luther King Park. And as far as my research can tell, the first place in the world to take the name of Dr. King after his assassination because of leaders like Sandra's father and a lot of folks in the community. But that idea of it being, before then, eviscerated and cut in half and the impact that had on community. But then this other story that some of you may be aware of that happened not that long ago, and that idea of a dog park in Martin Luther King Park, moving along through the park system and with neighbors in Kingfield as kind of a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you have a dog park? Well, talk to some of your black neighbors and learn about the history of dogs and Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. And that led to, and just to kind of summarize briefly, a really intense but I think important conversation and some reconciliation to some degree in that neighborhood that led to a commission of folks who really oversaw how the park kind of was improved and managed and what the legacy of the neighborhood was. One manifestation of it that I wanted to get to was that wonderful Black History playground that is a must-see and kind of really unique that I know of in the world as well. But that is kind of this manifestation of this process, like you all are doing here today, of coming together as a community, learning about your history and talking about it and processing it, and then it leading to action, most importantly. So one of the things we learned about Jim Crow of the North and the kind of the inciting incident in the film is this mob in Prospect Park that was trying to oust these two black families who had moved in and were building homes in the neighborhood. So I think what I've been thinking about this morning with this gathering is this idea of the neighborhood associations where action and work really happens. In that case, of course, it was the kind of some of the dark work and the insidious processes of gathering and organizing, right? This lynch mob, this organized and congenial lynch mob in Prospect Park. Congenial lynch mob. It's kind of Minnesota, isn't it? And lynching is, on my mind as someone who told the story of the Duluth lynching 100 years ago and the creation of the memorial in Duluth. But so this idea of neighborhood organizations is really important, powerful, and one that I think is underutilized in movement work. And we always think of the big organizations or the traditional civil rights organizations, but what happens on the ground in these 80-some neighborhood organizations? 71 now. Under-resourced, not as diverse as they need to be, not as inclusive as they need to be, but this is really where the action happens. So I was just curious, how many of you all, like me, are not from the Bryant neighborhood by show of hands? How many people? Wow, right on. This is dope. So thanks for Bryant neighborhood for doing the work for all our neighborhoods, apparently. So as you talk this morning, this afternoon, and gather in small groups, that's going to be really interesting to see how you kind of can take away from what this neighborhood is pioneering. So this idea of organizing in a way to challenge Black home ownership is the story of the restrictive covenants, really. And just many of you have seen the documentary, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. But it comes out of both a kind of a corporate and a capital perspective of this idea of the business of homeownership, but also it's government, banks, insurance, and then realtors. And something we didn't go into in great detail in Jim Crow of the North is kind of the complicity and the role that real estate played then. Because I think from what I've gathered in the many conversations that we've had around screenings of Jim Crow of the North, that's kind of where a lot of the tension is now. We've had one great discussion in Linden Hills, interestingly, in the kind of deep within the Green Line part of Minneapolis. A couple of Black realtors were talking at length about what they've seen in terms of steering and some of the other ways that discrimination is playing out today in housing. When you've got Fair Housing Act moderately enforced and other things in place with banks to try and minimize the discrimination that happens at that level, it still is that interpersonal level. It still is that neighborhood level that we saw in Jim Crow of the North, both in Prospect Park And then on 46 in Columbus, right, with the Lee House, and that idea of, in that case, again, another lynch mob literally forming to oust an African American World War I veteran who had moved in. One of the things I was thinking about, just in terms of enforcement and safety, is in all the research and the couple ways I've told the story of the Lee House. One, by learning about Lena Smith, the black lawyer from just a few blocks away, one of the first black female lawyers in the nation, who really kind of as an NAACP leader, really stood up against the mob and the segregation and the city in the case of the Lee House in the early 30s. But this idea of who was protecting Arthur Lee. And it wasn't the cops. Eventually, Lena leaned on the governor even to get the National Guard. She was like, we need the National Guard on the South Side. This is a lynch mob. But it was actually his fellow postal workers. And I always thought that was powerful. His fellow World War I veterans. So, this idea of being in solidarity, as we are this morning, is crucial. And that's what happened in the Lee House. This was an interracial group of postal clerks and veterans who were armed and protecting the Lee family from a mob, and some of them were actually physically assaulted themselves. So that mob was a little more dangerous than even my storytelling suggests. So, that again, to me, speaks about on the neighborhood level, how we're policing our communities. A lot of you all were, I know, patrolling and protecting in recent weeks in your neighborhoods and ours, and I appreciate that. And I think we have to continue that same kind of vigilance on things like gentrification and other less obvious threats, like skinheads and boogaloo boys, but things like gentrification, kind of some of these more subtle forms of systemic violent racism that affect us. Some of the things that I like to look to in these histories as well are the solutions. And so in Jim Crow of the North, we did talk about some of the ways over the generations, and it is like a generational effort in this case to try and get just something like the Fair Housing Act. But that idea of solutions really happening at the community level. And again, this is where I'll be really interested to hear where conversations go, how neighborhoods are organizing with this tension. There are, ways we can see solutions in the history, and that's again something that I like to surface. It was interesting. It was an article, but actually an ad in the newspaper, and it was a petition. So it's kind of like old school social media, but it was this list of names of folks who supported integrated neighborhoods and fair housing. And this is before Fair Housing Act. It really was before Minnesota's Fair Housing Act of the early 60s. So it's just a long list of names, and this was faith-based organizations, as is the case in the movement. But it was just hundreds and hundreds of names of people who were basically kind of making a statement, signing a petition, standing up. It was like maybe a Black Lives Matter sign in a lawn of the state too, saying, we're for fair housing. And again, then taking out an ad and then continuing this idea of like old school social media. The ad had a little coupon kind of thing you could cut out and sign it and send it in and add your name. But that idea of just standing up is kind of what I saw in that early 60s version of, kind of representing. But we have to continue that work. My wife was just telling me this morning, some of you probably, this may have happened to, that Black Lives Matter signs are getting stolen out of yards now. So, must remain vigilant and must continue to kind of do this work. So I'm really excited about the conversations that are going to happen here today and ongoing, really learning from the history. And I do encourage you to, if you haven't, to watch the story on Lena Smith from my documentary North Star, Minnesota's Black Pioneers, and you can get to know more about Lena, because she is a woman, in terms of her biography, who I think offers a lot of what we need and are looking for in terms of solutions. She was an entrepreneur. The sister was as I said, one of the first Black female lawyers in the nation, and certainly the first in Minnesota. She worked as an embalmer. She was a hairdresser. She was then a real estate agent, and I think that's what turned her on to the discrimination. And then as she became a lawyer, that was one of her focal points. But it's an important biography, and as Sandra and I are kind of describing, this idea of these stories of our neighbors, some of them neighbors in history, I think offer a lot of lessons that we can learn from today. So you can find that at tpt.org. It's North Star, Minnesota's Black Pioneers is the documentary, and Lena Smith is a Southsider from just a few blocks away. 3905 Fifth Avenue. Gordon Parks lived on 39th and 4th Avenue. Judge Pamela Alexander and Judge Lejeune Lang are in, just the power and the people in this neighborhood. I find compelling. So one of the things that I'm interested in, and that we're quietly working at in different ways, is that you're in a historic Black district, as Sandra mentioned. And I think naming that and identifying it, and beyond even just the historic Tilson-built homes and the awesome Lee market, but just the power.
City council person,
Right.
first Black mayor.
Yeah, Sharon Tills Bowden. Right?
Yeah,
So seriously, it's powerful, and there's a lot to learn. And the concern is we lose that momentum of history if we don't kind of carry forward these stories. But just invoking their names, saying their names, there's so much power in that. And what did Mayor Sharon Tills Bowden stand for? What is Judge Lejeune Lang's story of her family pushing back against restrictive covenants and redlining and discrimination? Likewise, Pamela Alexander's story as a young Black woman interested in the law. There's a lot of power there. So Jim Crow of the North is the struggle and the dark history that we're challenging and pushing against, but there's a lot of really powerful restorative narratives, stories of strength in our neighborhoods. So I really encourage you to draw from that, and definitely from the leaders amongst you. So maybe I'll leave it at that, unless there's more. If you want to chat a little bit, Sandra, we could kind of build on that. I'm not sure we're doing a time.
This is not the only time you'll be here. So, but maybe if people have a question or two, we have time for that.
Could you maybe explain the racial covenant and the Mapping Prejudice project, how that kind of came about? Sure.
Yeah. So again, many of you saw the documentary, but for those who didn't, so this idea, and I described this incident in 1908, 09, 1910 in Prospect Park, where a Black family moved in, mob couldn't get them to leave, so developers were looking for tools to prevent that from happening again, and really to create exclusive, restricted areas. And they learned primarily from California of this idea of the use of restrictive covenants. And so covenants are in all of your deeds if you're a homeowner. It kind of can describe everything from the materials to build a house to different codes and the lot alignment. But in this case, it's racially restrictive covenants, contracts that call out who can and can't occupy the home, that were embedded into homes in Minneapolis and in Hennepin County, really beginning after that incident. So from 1910 on through the mid-century, really, these covenants were kind of baked into housing development as homes were developed and spread throughout Hennepin County and Ramsey County, as we're learning now, where Mapping Prejudice is now working. And so that basically set this kind of grid where these restrictive covenants were, where Black folks and other people of color, sometimes Jewish people, couldn't move. That kind of started to create these disparities that we see today, because you started to see the inequities emerge. You saw the red lines imposed. You saw these formal barriers and informal ones enforced through kind of citizen terror and other systemic racism. Then you saw with the FHA, the red lines again formalizing these covenant boundaries and enforced by policing kind of patrols. And then just, as I mentioned, just kind of the culture and the economics of real estate, really baking in these restrictions. And the Mapping Prejudice team, whose research this is based on, and who I worked with to do the documentary, they've done some recent research on some of the economics. And I probably won't be able to cite it precisely, but they've really confirmed what we're worried about, and that a covenanted home, that's exactly the same. So it's not about whether you're on the lake or the creek. It's like the one thing that makes the difference is if the home has a covenant, and that there's 40% more value in that home. So the same homes, one of them over here in a red line neighborhood, similar home, a few blocks south, 40% more value. So then you kind of, multiply and amplify that generationally, and you get to that generational disparities that we see today. And so again, we persist in spite of that in this neighborhood. But so the Mapping Prejudice team has completed Hennepin County, so you can go to their website, check out your home. You can also volunteer as they're now working on Ramsey County. And I was glad as a Southsider and a Minneapolis person, St. Paul kind of got off the hook in my documentary. But now the research is going to help us really understand what happened to Rondo, right? Like we know now that these restrictive covenants kind of lay this this grid again, where ultimately freeways might be designed and planned because of the devaluing of Black and brown communities. So Mapping Prejudice continues, and it's a really powerful way to get engaged and involved, and they need the help. So thousands of people volunteered to go over the deeds for Hennepin County, and in doing that, it was cathartic for those who were involved. And as the Mapping Prejudice team will tell you, it was mostly white folks, so there was kind of a reconciliation experience in that, but it was really also about action and accountability, and so getting involved, getting informed seemed to be pretty transformational for a lot of people involved. But I get asked a lot also about the impact today, and are there, people aren't sure about the covenants and what they mean. They've been rendered pretty inert, but there was, some of you may have saw legislation at the last session that was passed that allows you to discharge the covenant in your home. So it's kind of largely a symbolic act, but it's a powerful one. We don't want to delete it, right? We need that history. But that was an important, and when the governor signed it, just that idea of his awareness, being raised because of us raising our voices, telling these stories through the restorative narratives, like a Jim Crow of the North, and then having the governor kind of get it, was powerful. So, but again, the FHA is just like the Civil Rights Acts of the 60s. It can all be undone, and it is in some ways being chipped away at. Even the Community Reinvestment Act is already vulnerable. Voting rights are vulnerable, so it's not like it's over. But most importantly, we're still living with the legacies and the disparities in a way that's affecting all of these awesome kids. Hopefully not all, but in real ways in school and work and home opportunities. Any other questions about Jim Crow of the North or some of this history? Maybe in your small groups, you can chat more about it. Cool. Yeah. Yeah.
Contradict that, those covenants.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the Tilson built homes. Anyone live in a Tilson built home that you know of? Right on. Cool. So
Does everybody know what that is?
so there was an effort then mid-century, mid-50s, because again, we knew about these disparities, throughout, from 1910 on. Certainly black folks did, and we're always resisting. But there was kind of a confluence of policy and private sector efforts with some, activism in the mix. Where, in a nutshell, Archie Given Sr., a real pioneering African-American entrepreneur in Minnesota, worked with David Tilson, a developer, and they created what were the nation's first intentionally open, meaning open to black folks, the nation's first open new housing development in an urban area like ours. And so it was pretty lauded and highly regarded at the time. And Archie told me about watching as a kid. He would be there and seeing African Americans come to these open houses, and he said you could just sense how powerful this was, how rare an experience. And so new homes too, that now could use some help, but that was a pretty groundbreaking moment. And so I was glad that they were marked, Sandra, that this idea of this is a historic district kind of makes it a conversation piece and can raise awareness as a solution of a kind, where again, it's kind of pushing from community, some public policy, and then getting private investment to come along through pressure, but then also just having someone like Tilson, who was known to do this, right? So he was transgressive in a way as a developer, a white developer, who said, I'm gonna make this effort, and I'm gonna work with the community. And I don't know a lot about Tilson and what kind of sanctions he might have faced in his milieu of, wealthy white land developers and home builders. But that's what we need, right? That's why all you all are here, like David Tilson, as you are intentional in trying to make change in your community. So Tilson built's a cool story that I wish I knew more about, frankly. Yeah. What else, Sandra?
I mean, I think one of the things is Minneapolis is kind of that picture of Minnesota nice. So you had segregation that you didn't talk about. So when I was growing up, okay, black people didn't live on the other side of Chicago Avenue. They just didn't. Maybe one, maybe two, but that was the line of demarcation. With the Tilson built homes, really black people at that point were not allowed to buy past 38th Street. So that really pushed not only black people further south into South Minneapolis, but also it was an opportunity for the first time. These were brand new homes, and they were specifically built, like you said, so that anyone, especially black people, could buy them, and they did. And so I grew up just a couple blocks away, but I had friends who lived on 39th and on 5th Avenue and 4th Avenue, and so those are Tilson homes. And so the district is now, there's signs of demarcation. And when we talk about the segregation in Minneapolis and how firm it was and how untalked about it was. Tilson was really, along with Archie Gibbons, really were two people who came together to push that and to bring about that change for the first time in South Minneapolis.
Just a quick, just a little data to support just how powerful that was. In, let's see, in that era, in the early 50s, between the end of the war and 1952, there were almost 10,000 single and two-family homes built in Minneapolis. 20 Negro families have gained access to such properties as purchases from the Star Tribune. 20 black families, 10,000 homes. That's pretty profound, and that's not for lack of having the resource and the ability. That's one of the things we learned, is that, you know, black folks were working, had resource in spite of everything, and so it wasn't not having the cash. But 20 out of 10,000, 20 black families able to buy in between the end of the war and the mid 50s. So Tilsonville was crucial at that time for that kind of opportunity. Interestingly, and I know renting is an issue that we didn't get to at all in Jim Crow of the North, but the statistics were equally stark for renters. In the next passage, it says of about 1,600 privately owned rental units that were constructed in that time frame, at present occupied by no Negro family. Not one is at present occupied by a Negro family. 1,600 rental properties. So, you know, that's, again, we talk a lot about home ownership, but in Minneapolis now, that's hard for anyone. And so this idea of renting, and in these neighborhoods, that's stunning. So that history is equally kind of strained.
And it's also important, as we talk about racial segregation, we need to talk about it and understand it from the perspective that white supremacy is what drives this stuff, right? So black people living next to each other is not the root of the problem. White people living next to each other is not the root of the problem. It's the allocation of resources. It's when white community members monopolize on the resources and leave black and brown folks with crumbs to fight over. That's the problem. So there was a Time magazine article that was published yesterday, and it centered the voice of Myron Orfield. Who has heard of him? Raise your hand. He's terrible. He is a white supremacist, but he's pushing his political agenda through integration. And what he wants to do is he believes communities of color are the problem, which means the answer is to break up communities of color. So make sure, as we see these narratives and we read and digest this media, that we're being critical, right? And integration can only happen when people are operating from equal positions of power. Otherwise, we're just recreating the slave and slave master relationship, and we're calling it something else, right? So, again, I just want to bring, before we break up into small groups, I want to bring this back to 38th in Chicago, right? So, you know, the reopening of 38th Street, 100% will prevent the vision that black folks have for that corner. The reopening, mark my word, you don't have to believe me, just watch. When 38th Street reopens, we're going back to business as usual. The politicians are not listening to us, clearly. They're not listening to folks at the memorial. Who are they listening to? Business interests, developers, Cup Foods, right? I know some of the businesses are struggling. We need to uplift Smoke in the Pit, the White. We need to uplift Dragon Walk, but Cup Foods needs to go, right? And they, don't get me wrong, I've never said they were the problem. They're a symptom of a bigger problem, but it's clear people want them gone, and the threats of attacking the store makes our whole community unsafe. If somebody burns down Cup Foods, that's dangerous for all of us. So they need to go. They can move 6 blocks away, or they can move somewhere close, and they'll be fine, right? They own property. They can sell it, make a profit, and keep their enterprise down the street. So again, this narrative that what's happening at the memorial is dangerous, right? There was some shootings last night. I haven't read the actual report. But our council member didn't say that when Chauvin murdered George Floyd. She didn't say this community is dangerous. She didn't paint the same grim picture when the people that are getting paid off our tax dollars are murdering our community members. We're going to create that narrative because, again, if you've been listening to black folks all this time, you would know The police are not here to create public safety. Daniel Bergin just explained a very sophisticated system of Jim Crow. So if we break that down, and we'll do this over time, we're talking about business interests, right? Corporations, politicians, police, education, media, nonprofits. They all have to work together to create the sort of racial inequity that exists here in Minneapolis, that created the conditions for a revolution or an uprising or a riot, whatever the hell you want to call it. These systems work together. They are super sophisticated. It's time to start breaking them down. It's time that we understand we've been lied to. This is about extracting wealth from black and brown bodies, taking land from Native Americans, and shifting those resources to white communities. And the police are an instrument to enforce that. Again, you don't have to agree with me, but we're going to take you on this journey over the course of these meetings. And me and Sandra are putting together training that we will announce soon. It'll be this summer. We're still working on that. But this is the sort of stuff we want you to unpack in the block meetings, right? Where we can talk more in depth about this. So before we break up, let's give a hand to Daniel Bergin, Sandra Richardson, our guests. Thank you so much. And also, as we break up into small groups, there's a lot of questions. Who has not been able to get through all the questions last week or the week before? Raise your hand if your group was not able to. So one way we've been getting through them is each person answers all the questions. I think it's like 7 or 8 questions, and then the last 2 are more instructional about the block meetings. So if one person answers all the questions and we go around, and we take about 5 minutes each, and our groups are 10 or so or less, we should be able to get around. Let's make sure that we give everybody a chance to speak. Let's make sure we practice radical listening, and let's make sure we're centering black voices too. And we know clearly we're missing a lot of black voices in the historical black community, right? So we got to do that work as well. And before I pass it to Malik, before he breaks us up, he's going to ask anybody who agreed to help facilitate, or anybody who wants to facilitate a small group who has that sort of experience, come up here in a minute. But let's remember George Floyd real quick. Let's just have a moment of silence. How about that? Rest in peace, George Floyd. All right, thank y'all.
Okay, another round of applause for our speakers. All right, thank you. So we're going to go into breakout groups right now. So we have, there's a couple of things we have set up here. So the first thing is that we have stakes for the blocks. So if you are in Bryant and your block is up here, so we got 5th all the way to Chicago, we got Clinton, we got everything up here. So grab your stake and then go into your group like last time. I'm going to have the small group facilitators that are here right now come to the front. Jake, Sonia, Art, Steph's right here, Brother Marjaan, Sandra, Kaylee, Christy, Brandon Royce, Katie Royce, Carissa, and Ken Holt. And then anybody who's interested in volunteering to be a facilitator, come on up. And so we're going to have you break up around the park and go into these. If you see a facilitator, if you happen to not be representing one of these blocks, go to one of these facilitators.
And if you're from outside of this neighborhood, just hop into a group and just participate.
Exactly.
A lot of folks just came to observe and see what we're doing. Just hop in.
Yep, just hop into a group if you're outside of Bryant. And so there's a couple of things to remember here. So we have questions up here. The first thing is, don't forget to sign up the sign-up sheet when you're heading out. And then the biggest thing about the groups is we have 9 questions, but also offer an opportunity if there are Black elders, community members within your group, to lead those groups and to basically talk. And then white allies help check each other with other white folks. The other thing is that we are transitioning into a new society and a new world, and we all get to shape that future, especially those who have been ignored. So with that being said, let's break up into our small groups, and then we're going to reconvene in about 35 minutes. So All right, come up and get your stakes, and then go with a facilitator.